This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE, leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments, ship faster with an AI code assistant, and work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps on going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Front End Happy Hour podcast. This is part of our Sips of Wisdom series, interviewing amazing people in tech and learning about their careers. Today, I'm really excited to be talking with Angie. Angie Jones is joining me to talk about her career, and I'm excited to dive in. Angie, welcome to Front End Happy Hour.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thanks for joining me. I think to start off with, I would love to hear a little bit about yourself, a little intro of who you are, what you do, and then what your favorite happy hour beverage is.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm Angie. I'm from New Orleans, so definitely love a good happy hour.
New Orleans has some good drinks, that is true.
That is true. Yeah, I work in developer relations. So I lead developer relations at TBD, which is the newest business unit for Block. And we focus on open source technologies, which is really fun and interesting in a fintech environment. So Block is formerly known as Square. So you may have heard of them. They're a company that's made Cash App, Square terminals, and all of that good stuff. And so my business unit specifically focuses on like open source SDKs and APIs in this realm. So it's interesting work for sure.
That is really cool. I'm sure you come across like just a variety of different things that you're dealing with too, because of like
Oh my
dealing
God.
with financial stuff is always interesting. And then like I love that you could said it with open source too. You're like, that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's really funny. I say like the tech part is the easiest part of it all. Like there's all of this stuff around compliance and regulations and stuff like that. And people get really nervous about us developing in the open sometimes when they're not used to this, right? And so it is interesting.
Yeah, I've never worked at like a financial company, but I worked at agencies that would get hired by banks and I'm trying to think what other financial, even just like large companies that are e-commerce, like a Walmart or Target or things like that. And yeah, the banks especially were just like the regulations and things that you'd have to go through, the compliance of even just accessibility, which not a bad thing, but you would go to the like just triple A or double A compliance, and it's just a lot of extra work, which means you move a little bit slower, which in tech has always been that mantra of like we'll steal from Facebook of like move fast and break things. That doesn't work in financial, and you have to be actually very not slow, but you just have to make sure you are really doing your due diligence before shipping.
I'm so glad you said that because like I feel like people are like, oh, you guys haven't released yet, or we have released, but this was back then. But it was like, oh yeah, you've been working on this for a year. Where is it? But you're exactly right. Like I said, the tech part is not what's hard, but it's just making sure we dot our I's and cross our T's and things like that. So
You can't make mistakes with people's money for some reason. Like, I mean,
no,
people
no,
get
no, no.
upset.
They do. And then the stuff that we're doing is for like international payments and things like that. And so now you have, different regulations across the globe that you have to adhere to. So yeah, fun stuff for sure.
Oh man, yeah, you've just opened a can of worms on that one too, because like that, there's some interesting things that like I never would have learned unless working on some of those things that like actually at Netflix, that was something that working on some of the payment operators across the world, just so that, people could pay for Netflix it was so interesting. There are things that I just never would have understood. I'm curious for you, what's been the most like challenging or interesting country for payments that you've had to work on?
Yeah, like we have a really big focus right now on the global south, specifically like countries in Africa and in Latin America, because we don't realize this a lot in the US, but they're pretty excluded from like the global financial scene, you know? And so it's really difficult to send payments to them, for them to send payments outside of their countries and things like that. And so just realizing that, like even sometimes now I'll post about things that I'm working on. And depending on where you live, you don't even get it. It's like, why would you need that? And it's like, oh, yeah, your life is comfy. These folks over here, not so much. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's even just like it's wild too how many even countries are very much like cash payments. And so, you're like, how do you translate cash over the internet? And there are ways, but it's like in the US, you're right. We're just very like just not used to that. And so you're like, what do you mean? Everyone doesn't just have a credit card and they just, put that in and everything's good, right? It's like, no, that's not as simple as that. So I love that there's just so many challenges in that space that people just don't realize.
Yeah, it was funny when I first went into his roles. I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he tweeted something to me like that I should learn about money. And I was so offended, Ryan, because I'm like, what is he talking about? Is he mansplaining me? I know about money. I make money. And I kind of snapped on him a little bit. And then once I got into the job, I was like, oh, he's right. I don't know anything money. I had to go back and find that tweet like months later and apologize to that man. Like, okay, now I get what you meant. I'm reading a book. I'm totally learning about money. I get it now. But yeah, it's a lot.
I mean, good for you to go back and apologize too, because I mean, it's like I get it. Your first like inkling of like, oh, is this person just mansplaining? You're like, that's probably your gut reaction is probably right 99% of the time. But it is funny. It's like, yeah, when you put your like global view of something like money, you're like, wow, there's so many things that we just don't know. And I mean, you can read about it, but also like you need a good reason for that. And I think sometimes being put in the situation where you're building something tech related that works for users outside of the US, it's just eye opening. And I very much appreciate those things because I think like reading about it's just not the same. It really isn't. Like it's like we always say like learning is doing and that's how you learn best. Well, that's kind of one way to learn about like other countries or their payments. Traveling is a good way too. And so I think like yeah, you can read about it all day long, but it's just not the same. So now, Angie, you know it all. You're dealing with so many different payment methods. Well, let's start maybe going into like I would love to know like right now you're global vice president of developer relations at Block. How did you go from being an engineer to all the way down the leadership chain or up
Yeah.
the leadership chain?
That's really funny too, Ryan, because this was never my goal to even get into like leadership in this capacity. I've always said since I started working as an adult that I wanted to stay on the technical track. And so I managed to do that pretty well. And then I got into developer relations. And so I started leading the developer relations initiative at Amplitude as an IC, but then, as I grew that, then you need to build a team. And, so then you just kind of start getting into those leadership roles. And that was a startup. And so in startup lands, you grow up pretty quickly, right? Because you have all of these different responsibilities and you're basically working 2 or 3 jobs all kind of wrapped into one. And so that really expedited my learning and my trajectory on the leadership path. And so after several years at Amplitude, I then came over to Block to do something different. Still in developer relations, but a totally different avenue. At Amplitude, I was working on AI stuff before it was like really trendy. And test automation was a big area for me. And so I was just ready to kind of do something different. And so came over to Block to learn about money.
I love that. I mean, and I think that's cool. I think anywhere in my career journey, it's always like I need a new challenge, and you kind of just like, this is different, and kind of dive in. Same thing with leadership. I love that what you said. It's like sometimes you don't set out, like nobody's like, I want to be a software engineer and ultimately be a leader. Like I don't think anyone's like trying to go down that path. It just kind of happened. It's a new challenge. And I also love what you said about the startups. Like honestly, being at a startup, you learn so much so quickly, and it is because you're playing different roles. Like it just happens that way. You may not have the title of all the roles that you're playing, but it's just like someone's got to fill the gaps, and I'm thankful for having that experience too. Like I feel like being at startups sometimes is really exhausting, but when you look back at like a year of at a startup can sometimes be like multiple years at other companies, just from a learning perspective.
No, you're absolutely correct. I've worked at the big companies, I've done IBM, I've done Twitter, I've done like all of those big companies, and startup was different. I definitely feel like, and then I was there for 4 years, which is like, I don't know, felt like 20 years if you
Yes,
think about
yes.
like what I've learned and what I've accomplished there versus, the other roles.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that. And 4 years at a startup is a long time. Like it truly is, because like I always think like 8, 10, 10 years or something like that at a company is a long time in general. But like 4 years is probably double. So you're at that like 8 years at a company, which is a
Yeah.
long time. Yeah. I'm curious. So you moved to developer relations. Like what made you want to focus on that in the first place?
Yeah, this one was very organic. So I'm pretty like strategic, but I didn't like strategize this one. So I really just enjoy writing, engaging with community, speaking at conferences, those sorts of things. So I just did those things in my spare time, basically,
Hmm.
as an engineer. And I remember it was when I was an engineer at Twitter, that I was basically killing myself because the demand had grew for like me to do workshops and like conference talks, and so now I'm traveling the world and doing this stuff. But hey, again, this is in my spare time, which is still during work hours. Twitter was kind enough to allow me to do this, but I still needed to do my engineering job. So I remember being in Europe one time and I needed to do a full day workshop. So it's like 8 hours I'm teaching a workshop. And then I would go back to my hotel room that night, and now it's like US hours, and I'm working like another 8 hour shift to kind of do my job. And I was like, okay, this is getting old really quickly. And I just was talking to a friend, like, man, I wish there was a way I could get paid for this other stuff that I actually like to do. And they told me like, oh, there's like developer relations. I didn't even know that was a thing. And so I started looking into that a bit more, and I was like, yes, this is exactly what I like to do. Because even as an engineer, I would work as an adjunct professor. I love teaching. I love like helping other engineers like learn something new. Like that's really satisfying and rewarding to me. So yeah, I was like, I'm gonna take the leap. I'm gonna do it. And fortunately, I had made some acquaintance and networked with people at all of these conferences that I'd been going to. And so I knew the CEO at Applitudes and kind of shared with him, like, my goals, my new goals. And fortunately, he thought that they needed that exact skill set in house. And so we kind of made that work.
Oh, I love that. Even hearing
Yeah.
that you basically pitched it essentially too,
Yeah.
of like, hey, this is, and they're like, yeah, we kind of do need this. And
Yeah, we
so
do.
that's so cool. I love that aspect too, and I can relate to of just like what you said about the community and teaching others is like, I don't know, there's something rewarding. I think that like I love that about the tech community. I mean, there's a lot of negative too, but there's a lot of positive that come around it from folks like yourself who just are like, I want to give back and get and feel rewarded for it too. It's not like you're doing it just because it's like you enjoy it too. And I think that that's amazing. And I think we need more of that too, where it's like, hey, how do we like teach others? And like we all had to start somewhere, and it was not easy. And so it's nice having folks like yourself who are like, yeah, I enjoy teaching and I want to give back. I love that part of our community, and that there's like things like Twitter, like you working there. It's like Twitter has been great for that, where it's like it's built this community where you can learn from others. So developer relations is a great field. Like it really truly is. So it was like nice that it brought your passion and you're like, hey, you can actually do this for a living now, Angie.
Right, exactly. And I would credit a lot of that to like the networking of things like Twitter and conferences and stuff like that. You don't even know what's out there until you become a part of a external community and kind of see what's going on in the.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like I'm always encouraging people like at least just, maybe it's not Twitter, but like find your like community where there
Yes.
is other folks and having those conversations. It's so meaningful. Like you don't have to engage all the time or, be involved a lot. It's just like a great spot to kind of have that external community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, being in leadership, I always love like people going down this path because I think it's so interesting because like I said earlier, it's not something that you set out or like strategize early in your career, but it just kind of happens. And I'm curious, like one thing I always like to ask leaders is like about their leadership style. Like Angie, like how would you describe how you lead or, I don't know if it has to be this philosophy of your leadership, but like how do you approach leadership in general?
Yeah. Even before I went into leadership, I was always a cheerleader of people, right? And so I think people who might follow me online will see that I'm like always rooting for people and trying to encourage them and want them to be their best selves. And so I approach leadership kind of the same way. I'm like, oh, I'm like a manager that's like akin to a celebrity manager, right? And so you're the star, you're the talent. Let me find opportunities that help you grow, that help get your name out there, that help you shine, that help elevate you. Like that's how I think my leadership style is like getting to know the person, what their goals are. Sure, we do have business goals. Let me figure out how those things align so that your entire profile is elevated.
I love that so much because I think part of being a great leader is that your job is absolutely that is like how do you make the people on your team shine and even just finding the right things for them to shine like yes like you said there is a business goal so like if someone on your team wants to build robots but you're a software company you're like I can't give you that, like, so, like, is there something that I can try and help that? Or maybe I have contacts at another company that could help you. Like, I think about that is like, how do you tie what someone's interested in, what they're passionate about to like how the outcome that your company needs? And hopefully you can find that. And it might not be in your team, right? Like, it could be in another team. So, how are you trying to figure that out? I think that's so important as a leader to be looking out for your team and like how do you think about their progression. It's not your job to do it all for them, like I always say that as well, but I think I've seen leaders too where you can see them climbing the ladder and you're like wait, when was the last time they promoted someone or did something for someone else's career? And I think that in order to be a great leader, you can look out for yourself, but you also have to be looking out for others. And I love your approach and that's what you highlight. Do you think like as you moved into leadership at Apply Tools and now Block, throughout the years, do you think it's evolved? Has your leadership changed at all? Or how do you think about it? Do you approach things differently?
I think my fundamental approach and values have probably stayed the same. Definitely some evolution there though. Like I said, at Amplitude, this just kind of happens. So it wasn't anything that I prepared for. And I quickly learned, Ryan, that like you have to put in the work. These are not like interchangeable skills, right? Like I think I'm pretty good software engineer. That doesn't translate to like you're going to be an excellent like software engineering manager or leader, it just doesn't. And so I had to take a step back, and you have to put your ego to the side for this, right? Because you're used to like being a star, you're great, like And now it's like, oh, wait, why am I not like amazing just right out the bat, you know? And it's like, oh, because I like nurtured that craft. Like I went to school, I learned even while on the job. And so I had to humble myself to say, okay, these are new skills that you have to pick up. You have to put in the work to learn them, right? And so I took classes on leadership. I still like read lots of books and things about leadership. And I also learned that it's not like one style fits all, right? Like you have different people here, and each one of these people are different. The way that you communicate them with them may need to vary. Like all sorts of things need to vary. So just learning about that. And I got older too, Ryan. I mean, and older, like the gap between like the people you're leading increases. And so now I have like this new generation of people that I'm leading, and it's like, wait, like my old strategies don't work with these folks. And so I even took a class. I love LinkedIn Learning, by the way. So LinkedIn Learning had this course about basically like Gen Z and for managers. And so I took this course to just kind of learn more about like that generation and their style of communication, feedback, all of that. Like one, I'm just going to throw this out. This is a freebie for y'all. One thing that stuck with me was they grew up in a social media era. As soon as you post something, that's instant feedback that comes in, whether that's likes, comments, or things like that. Whether that's good or bad, you know, you're getting this instant feedback. So they're used to that, right? And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I just started incorporating that in my learning, my leading style, where I'm just continuously giving feedback, whether it be good or bad. And people are very receptive to that.
I love that. I hadn't thought of that. Like, I mean, it
I
makes so
know.
much sense. And I think my style has typically been to give as much, give feedback constantly, and like don't sit on it and don't hold on to it, especially, critical feedback there or constructive feedback. You're like, I should tell them in the moment so that they're, understand that. But then equating that to the social media era, I'm like, that makes so much sense. You're right. Like it's that instant gratification or just instant feedback that you kind of just get used to. And I'm sure like it even shows up of like, just even sometimes emojis or things like that on Slack. Like if someone's like, here's my work, and you're like, oh, hearts, 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 and like, this is amazing. It's like that can be just enough to say like you're doing the right thing, or hey,
That's
this could be better. It's like in those moments. So I love that. That's amazing.
That's right. And it's so simple. It's like, oh, here's my PR, and you put a fire emoji on it. It's very simple, but that's a form of feedback, something they relate to. I'm on the right track. She's happy. I'm doing what I need to do, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important to get that like feedback too, to even just the positive. I'm guilty of this. Like I try to strive at telling someone if something's not going well and to be like really in the moment of doing that as quick as possible because you don't want it to like go on forever. But then oftentimes or at least me personally, sometimes I forgot like, oh, the positive reinforcement or positive feedback is so important too. Like you just said, that fire emoji is like, oh, Angie said that I'm on the right track, like I'm doing the right thing. And so that's so helpful too. You don't want people wondering if they're doing the right thing or, having that imposter syndrome of like, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing a good job? It's like if you can remove that from their state of mind, that's huge. So yeah, I love this. This is amazing. I learned something right now of just like thinking about that differently for our Gen Z folks. Like I think that's a really good call out. I love that it even changed your leadership style, like, or you just kind of reframed it a little bit. Because I think what I hear how you lead and I think is important is flexibility, right? Like you mentioned different people that you have, they're people you're dealing with. It's not code, it's not binary. It's like, yes, it is very much like there's this like squishiness of human beings. And I think it's really cool to just even think like, oh, well, now I'm leading Gen Z. I'm not that generation. How do they think differently? And they do. And so you could just put your head in the sand and go, well, this is the way that we do it, so get on board. You're like, nah, I want to figure out how to like just like change my way of thinking too. And you may not change everything, but like I love that flexibility aspect.
Yep. Yep.
So let's get back to developer relations, mainly because I love what you said. You're like, I didn't even realize this was a thing. And I feel like in the same boat, as much as like I can't remember when I first started speaking at conferences, or I was never a big teacher like doing the workshops. I have done it, didn't know that I would love it. I always thought I would be like, no, I can't do that. But it's something I've loved too, is giving back to the community, teaching people that like something I've learned. And so conferences, things like that was always something that was just kind of fun. It also put me out of my comfort zone to do that. But I never really thought of developed relations as a thing either. And I'm curious, what does it entail to be in that role? Like, what does that look like? Why is it important for companies to have that too? Because a lot of companies today don't have it. I think more and more companies are adding it, but not every company does. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I think that this role is pretty special because it requires like skills that we often think of as like opposite types of skills, right? So you need like pretty strong technical skills, which they call the hard skills, but then you also need to have empathy and like be able to communicate very well. And those are the soft skills, you know? And so it's like this combination of both that I think basically makes like this really special engineer who's able to go deep into like the technical details of like what it takes to maybe build an app using your product or something like that. But then they're also able to empathize with like people who are working in production development, or they're an indie developer or entrepreneur with, you know, not a lot of time or resources, being able to, like I said, communicate this in an effective way where, you know, you have engineers of varying backgrounds and levels who will be able to understand that. So I think a lot of, like I said, the teaching that I did at the colleges really helped prepare me for this sort of role, because, you know, you have a classroom full of students, all who are there maybe for different reasons, who all need to get this content. And some people understand it better this way and that way. So what's the least common denominator to break that down and speak like in plain English for people without context or background in this stuff already, so that everyone is successful by the time they leave that course, you know? And I think that relates really well with developer relations, you know?
Wow. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I love what you said of like you have to have that deep technical knowledge. But what I also heard you say too is that you also have to know when, like, at what level, right? Like, because there's different levels of people that you're dealing with. It's not like you're on your team that you're kind of, you know, day in, day out, and you're like, oh, I can go really deep technically with my team and talk through these scenarios. You're dealing with people at all different levels. And quite frankly, even just what they care about. Like you said, it could be that entrepreneur or that startup or someone who's, you know, an enterprise. It's all those varying degrees of what they care about. And so you have to get to that level and probably context switch too, because like you're dealing with someone this hour that's dealing with enterprise, and then the next hour you're dealing with someone who's like the sole entrepreneur by themselves. And I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm assuming that one of the biggest challenges, and maybe I'm wrong, I'd love to hear more of the challenges that come along with developer relations, but communication has to be one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, it definitely is. There's a lot of brilliant engineers who are not great at like explaining these concepts to layman folks. In some areas, like, yeah, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm talking to another developer. It's not exactly a layman, but I mean, could be, right? I mean, you know, they could be 1 year in and you're like talking at a level from someone with like 15 years of experience and background and context or whatever, you know? And so all of that is important, even the communication style of how you present something to someone. So I'm a Java champion. I love Java, right? And so there's this thing in the Java ecosystem where for a while we weren't putting out new releases of the language, and now we're putting them out like every 6 months, right? And so it's kind of hard for people to keep up. But then, Ryan, think about like people who do work at like an enterprise company or a bank, like we talked about. They're not jumping from version 8 to version 20 overnight because like you gave some fancy presentation at a conference. You know what I mean? And so that's where that empathy kind of comes in as well. And I've seen people who will communicate to them, oh, you're still on 8. Oh, that's so like, and like there's a sense of judgment there. And you're lacking empathy. Empathy as well as like kind of understanding what it's like to work in the real in the real world. Like, yeah, of course I would jump to 20 if I could, and I was chasing like the trendy new tools and features. But most companies, that's not their goal. They don't care about that. It's like we have business objectives to reach, and to make such a switch, you better have some good justification on like what that means for the business,
Yeah, what's the impact? Like, what is this going to do for
It
us?
can't be that you just want to use a new tool. That just can't be the reason.
No, and I think that could be a factor of like, hey, we've been on this legacy code. It's really hard to work with. But there again, you start to peel back the onion. You're like, oh, it's hard to work with. Do you think you'll save some time by going to this one? Oh, yes. Or they have this new feature that will enable us to do X, Y, and Z that we weren't able to do before. You can pretty much sell it and speak to those things, but also it comes at a cost too, right? Like you can't just easily, I mean, it's getting easier and easier to upgrade Java. Like, thankfully, I think more of the releases that's getting easier to do that, but it's not something that you can just upgrade and jump to the next version really easy. It is a disruption that happens on your team or releasing the product that you're trying to build that is the most important thing, or it could introduce bugs that, to your customers. There's a lot of things that you have to take into consideration. So I think you said that very well, is how important that is. And like you have to describe the impact that it's going to have. It's a business at the end of the day. No one's paying us to just play with the latest and greatest and have the most fun as engineers and build. It's like, no, you kind of have to build something that people need and use and can rely on.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so, like, all of those need to go into like consideration when you're out here supposedly as a developer advocate. Like you're advocating for a developer, but you need to understand like what their reality is.
Yeah, not shame them for, not being on the latest and greatest. I mean, we've all seen it too, like on Twitter and things like that. It's the worst. It's like, and you're like, yeah, but you're lacking context. You're lacking like why they haven't chose to go to the latest and greatest. There's good reason. I'm so used to the front end community too, where it's like every other day there's a new framework and people are like, oh, you're still on this one. And you're like, oh my goodness, like you can't just hop to every other framework. It's like, it just doesn't work like that.
Right. Maybe on your side hobby projects, but yeah, not on, a commercial product. You can't do that.
It's just not worth it either. Like it's introducing so much complexity, and people have to learn that too. Like on your team, they have to take the time to learn it. Yeah, there's just so much that goes into that. So I'm glad you called that out. That's like that is a challenge. Like dealing with different people and understanding, being empathetic too. So you mentioned communities, and I want to talk a little bit about communities because I think that is, I don't know, something I care about, and clearly you do as well. And I'm curious, like, how do you approach building communities, nurturing them, thinking about community, whether it be from the developer relations side of it, but even just personally? I see you out there, on Twitter and, up leveling people and just sharing great things. How do you think about that? How do you think what's important to a community? How do you add to it? Yeah, we'd love to hear that.
I think community is so important. I go back to my beginnings in tech. And when I went to college, I didn't know anything about computers, programming, anything like that, right? And so in taking like my first programming course, there were several other people in the course who were like same thing. They didn't know anything about this. We're all here trying to figure it out together. But that quickly became like this community of like just folks in the class who were all trying to learn something new. And so we just start helping each other. Maybe we form study groups, maybe we quiz each other, you know, we help each other with the homework and things like that, right? And I think that those values were instilled in me there, that, you know, you don't have to do this alone, because this stuff is hard. It's ever changing. Like there's just a lot of variables at play that taking it on by yourself is probably not the best way to approach it. And so when I started working like full time, you know, I always was involved in just like the various communities within like these larger companies, whether that be like, oh, the Java group or the women group or, you know, the Black folk group or whatever groups. And so you just start having like these community of people that share like the same values and possibly the same goals and things like that you can just kind of lean on. And then I started looking externally for like the broader like tech community, you know, and that's just been so helpful for me personally in my career. You know, like people that you can ask questions to and you don't have to worry about that, like getting back to your boss that you actually don't know a clue about this thing that you have to work on. You know, or people just freely sharing resources. Like that's why I started blogging. It was like we were interviewing for a role and I had like this amazing team of people that I learned so much from. We all learned so much from each other. And so we were like operating at this really efficient level. And then when we needed to bring someone else in, like no one we interviewed had this knowledge or like these skills. And I was like, we're hoarding this. I should blog about some of these techniques and stuff. Like, and so that's why I got into blogging, was just to like share it outside of the four walls that I was working with and kind of help the overall tech community, you know, up level in things that I learned internally or whatever. And so that's my view on community. Is very precious to me. It's something that I feel I need in order to be successful. And I try my very best to give back to community as well.
I love that. Well said. I love that it just instilled in you so early on. And you're right, like being in school, it's like it's so hard learning programming in general, or that first, like maybe you're in a boot camp, maybe you're just learning on your own. It's hard, and it's like, yeah, and I mean, I still learn things today. Like I think that's the thing too, is there's always new approaches. You can get the same result but done in a different way in programming, that you're like, oh, cool, I didn't know that technique. You know, it's like that's really cool to see. So I love that approach on the community aspect of it. Was there anything that you know, building community, that you've like maybe learned about yourself that you didn't realize was even important to you? Like you said, you're like, I learned that pretty early on and it's instilled in me, but like, have there been other things that you've seen value? I guess maybe that's the way to put it, is like, have you gotten other values from community building that you didn't realize when you set out thinking community was important?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I always thought I was talking to folks who were kind of like on the same level as I am. And so community is so diverse, right? You have people who don't even work in tech, but they want to break into it. Or, you know, people who are retired from tech. Like that's how diverse this is. Like it varies, right? And so that's something I know, it sounds obvious now, but it's something that I didn't think about until, you know, I was really deep in like kind of external tech communities. And it's I think that's helped me like not assume things about people, or back to that communication style of just like speaking at the least common denominator. Like I see people all the time, they'll throw around like acronyms, or, you know, or even talk about like tech that's not been around for like 20 years. So it's like, feels like an inside joke, you know, or you know, just things like that. So anytime I like communicate, I try to provide like a little bit of context. If I'm using acronyms, yeah, everybody in the room might already know what this means, but there could be one person that doesn't. I don't know. So I'm just going to assume there might be, and I'm just going to put it out there. You know what I mean? So those sorts of things, I think are important in just helping people feel welcome in community, helping them feel like they have a place there. They don't feel silly, asking questions or feel embarrassed because they don't know something.
Oh, well said, Angie. I think too of like even just sometimes spelling out the acronym or speaking to a term that you're like, oh, and that's what this means. It just does make people feel more welcome and included. And there'll be that one person in the room who just was like a little shy to raise their hand. It might even be that person like myself who's been, in tech for so long that I'm like, I forget what that acronym is. And you're like, I should know this. I'm embarrassed to ask. And it's like, yeah, it's just like there's too many things to remember all the time too. And so like speaking at a really like welcoming level, I think you can actually open up more deeper conversations, and everyone's on that same level when you're talking. I think is so important. It doesn't matter if you're brand new to tech or been there forever. It's like there's so much to remember and think about that it's fine if you don't know something, but it's hard to raise your hand. And so I think like you're just inviting more folks to the conversation by just speaking to it better.
And I don't think people like do that intentionally or even realize they're doing it, but it's something that I've learned to just be kind of conscious of and check myself on.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the communication, Angie. Like I think to me, communication is something that I've always wanted to do better at. I don't think anyone's perfect at communication. Yes, there's people who I'm like, even as you like in leadership roles, as you get higher and higher in a company, like if you're CEO, you have to be so good at communication, but they mess up too. But it's like, I think we grow and get better and better at communication, and it's this constant evolving learning aspect of it too. And so even that, you're like, I learned that, yeah, people don't all know this, and I have to invite them in, be a lot more thoughtful in how I approach this. And I think the person who's super technical, if you spell it in an acronym, they know that's not offending them, right? Like it's like
Like they don't care.
it doesn't
Yeah.
hurt. Yes, it's like yeah, I knew that. It's cool. Like yeah, it's so it's like it's kind of funny when you think of it that way. You're like, yeah, why did we try and make this acronym or make it hard for people? It's like it doesn't make sense. All right, I'd be curious as we're maybe, coming up later in the conversation, you've had a lot of experience, especially, well, as a software engineer, but even making the transition to developer relations. And I'd be curious, like, what kind of advice do you have for folks maybe wanting to get into developer relations, maybe folks that are already in it or doing a bit of that conference speaking already and, maybe wanting to do it more full time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually spoke with someone this week, and so I'm gonna pull from like some of the things that I talked to them about. So they were a developer who, kind of like me, were like, I like when I do that public speaking thing. I like writing things at work and stuff like that. And I might be pretty good at developer relations, but I don't have any experience in that per se. And I feel like a lot of the advice that's out there now is for people, might be looking to get into developer relations as their first job. So I'm not going to speak to that. There's a wealth of information there. I'll speak to the people that's already in tech and you're like, I might want to do a pivot, right? One of the things I'll say is that your developer background is super beneficial in this role. And, people might not realize that off the jump. They're just like, oh yeah, I've done development, but not necessarily this other stuff, and so I don't know if this is relevant. I'll tell you, it is very relevant. Not just the coding part, but like I talked about earlier, just the process of software development and understanding how that works and understanding that you're not coding on your personal GitHub in a vacuum, but there's like lots of other functions that you have to interact with, like, product and sales and marketing and design. And like you're getting a lot of requirements from a lot of people, and all of that factors into what you're doing. And I think like just understanding like those sorts of things is really powerful in a developer relations role, because you're able to empathize and you're able to understand like what people's circumstances are, right? I'll also say like so I'll tell my story of how I did this. I was doing like the blogging, the public speaking, the podcasting and all of that, but I wasn't doing it for a company. Like I said, I was just doing it on the side. And so that's a great way to kind of build some skill. One, to see if you even like this sort of thing before you like jump into it. And then two, like, are you good at it, right? And you'll then have like a little bit of experience doing it. I put all of that on my resume, Ryan, as a section, you know how you have your sections of, I did this job, and you have the company name, the years, the title, and all of that, right? So I put one for developer advocate, and I had the title, developer advocate. I put the years that I've been doing all of this stuff. The only thing that was missing was a company name. I didn't do it for a company. I just left it off. And I put the bullet points, or here's where I've spoken, here's like things I've written, here's videos, here's courses, and all of that. And so I show that, hey, yeah, I haven't been doing this for a company officially, but I have been doing it, right? And that showed like the experience level. And so when I went into developer relations, I was brought in as a senior developer advocate, not like a junior, because yeah, I haven't been doing it formally, but I have been doing it, you know? I know how to do it.
I would, quite frankly, sometimes doing it on your own is actually harder, right? Like, because you're doing all these things that a developer advocate would have done for a said company, but like you're doing it all on your own, right? Like, there's so much more work that goes into that.
The motivation to even do it, right?
Yes. Oh man, like because you still had that other job, Angie, like you said when you were speaking at, yeah, like it's like it is a distraction from both. Like you're trying to do both things, and it's harder to do that when you were like, if someone's like, yeah, you have the next week or two to no interruptions to write a talk for this said conference, you're like, amazing, like that's awesome to have dedicated time, paid time too, right? Like that's like a lot of these conferences that people are talking at, it's like, yeah, you're not getting paid. You're just doing this on the side. You're finding time in your evenings, weekends to put together a talk, then you're going to said conference, and so yeah, I'm glad that you spelled that out because that is important. That is a skill. You are absolutely doing it. I should probably take that advice. I have recently put the podcast as one of my things that I didn't, that was just something I've done for years on the side. And I'm like, wait, this technically is something that I'm doing. It is a skill set. And so I'm glad you called that out.
Yeah.
I'd be curious too, as just as we're wrapping up, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately too is the developer relations industry is changing drastically. And I would love to hear your thoughts of like, where do you think it's going? Where are the trends going? What should we be watching in the next like 4 or 5 years?
Yeah. You asked me a question earlier about like companies having a DevRel, you know, initiative and not all
Yep.
of them having it. So as we see DevRel kind of picking up, I don't advise companies that don't need this to just do it for the sake of doing it, right? Like you should probably understand why you will want such a function. And usually it's to kind of enable developers to be successful with your products, basically. And so if you don't have a developer audience or something like that, like you probably don't need this sort of thing. As far as like up and coming stuff or things we should probably watch out for, like I think COVID was a big shift for developer relations. Like there used to be tons and tons of travel involved. If you wanted to talk to people, you had to get on a plane. That's changing, and now people are warming up more to like virtual content and things like that. Video is taking off. I joke with my friends and my husband all the time because they're constantly sending me things to watch, you know, like on Twitter or LinkedIn or something like that. And if I'm looking through them, most of them are video. I can't watch them because because I can't turn the audio on right now, you know, like I'm doing something else, or I'm on a plane or something. I don't have my headphones, something like that. But I say all that to say, like, video is really taking off. Everybody's creating video and things like that. And so I really like what Jason Linchdorf is doing. So I'm going to give him a shout out. Like he's looking at how to make this stuff more entertaining. I always learned, like when I first started public speaking about tech, mentors would tell me like, yes, you're going to educate, but you're also going to entertain. People want to see a show, you know? and so I'm seeing more and more like the need to incorporate that in the content that we're creating, right? everybody's, as more and more developer advocates out there, more and more like docs and blogs and things like that, and they all start looking the same, and you just don't want to see them anymore. So you have to kind of lean into the entertaining side of it. Some might call that unfortunate. That's where we are, right? We're living in an era where people they have short attention spans, and they just kind of want something that excites them. And so that's where I see us moving as an industry. So that's why you see like a lot of the kind of people who have personalities and stuff, they might kind of land a DevRel role or something like that, because that, like it or hate it, that is a factor, right? That does help people want to consume your content and learn about your products and what you're building.
Yes, and I love that you called out Jason's content. Like, to me, I actually love it. I love that the quality and that he's trying to bring, just something different to the space, and I'm like all for that, because I think it is like we are fighting for attention with everything we do. Whether you're watching Netflix, whether you're watching YouTube, whether you're on Twitter, you're playing games, whatever it is, everybody is fighting for your attention. And so, yeah, unfortunately, that's the game. You got to stand out and try and, grab that attention. So well said. Angie, thanks so much for joining me. I thoroughly love this conversation. If people are wanting to get in touch with you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, online you can find me. I do still live on Twitter/X. My handle there is TechGirl1908. Also pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can just look up Angie Jones. I'm the one in the pink. And then at TBD we have a Discord. So if anybody's interested in any of this financial software that we're working on that's open source, you can go to tbd.website. We do have a Discord, and I hang out there every day as well. And if anybody wants to buy me a drink, I forgot to say what my favorite cocktail is. It's Malibu and pineapple juice.
Ooh, nice. So now, yeah, if you need to get advice from Angie, you know how to get her interested in speaking with you. I love that. Yeah, how did we forget that? We kind of just went in the topic, and yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Angie. I've loved having you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ryan.